That's it. The key to my car has been buy the lightest parts possible, put as little back into the car as possible. Comfort is not a thing. Trust me, the drive to Portugal was not comfortable, but it's a track car, and that's what I wanted. It's the real E46 LTW. So I've got the S54 throttle bodies on an M54, which is a very uncommon swap. I have Scorpion exhaust, KW suspension, Apex wheels, a BTCC front brake kit. I have M5F chassis rear brake calipers, which are electric. So I've got an electric handbrake on the car. I've taken a lot of weight off the car, fiberglass panels everywhere. I've got a custom fuse box, I guess we'll call it that. I've completely gutted the loom, redid the whole fuse box into a tiny little thing that probably weighs about 100 grams. Carbon roof, SPA seats, Samson's gear shifter. I have stuck with the 5-speed, which is lighter, and then just an extensive weight loss project. Completely sandblasted the car, which is things most people aren't aware of. So this car has been sandblasted underneath and inside. The car has had fire underneath to burn off all the undersill. So that's probably one of the biggest things that I've done to the car to make it lighter, is the sandblasting underneath, and there was literally kilos of stuff falling off from the car as I was doing it. The wiring loom has been redone. So I've completely redone the wiring loom to make sure that I have as little wires as possible. I think the only excessive wire that I have in the car at the moment, or wires, are the ones going to the old mirror, which the old rear view mirror. That's still in there because I plan to use one of those for the interior lighting. The rear lights are actually all fed from one side. I have, as I said, redone the whole fuse box. My fuse box is a completely new fuse box from Car Builder, and it uses microfuses, and I think it weighs maybe 100 grams. So all of that's been redone. So compared to the E46 fuse box, which is probably this big, and it uses quite large fuses and a lot of metal surroundings and plastic surroundings around it, my fuse box is now this big. All the fiberglass and carbon parts on it. So I've got a carbon roof. So this was had the sunroof before. So it's now got a carbon roof, which means I haven't got the metal. I know, again, it's a little bit, but I haven't got the metal structural part. I've got a cage, so I'm not worried about that. And I've got fiberglass panels as much as I could get done in time. Well, I think one of the other reasons my car is so light is 5-speed gearbox. So again, I've kept that to go light. I've still got the 330 prop shaft, which is thinner and lighter. I know I've got the M3 rear diff. You can make it work. The engine itself is as bare as it can be. I think the difference between an S54 and an M54, I think, is at least 45 kilos, if not more. But let's go conservative and say it's 45 kilo difference between one and the other. I think in general, I've just taken everything out of the car. It has no heater matrix. It has no aircon. That's why it's so light. There's nothing to the car. It's as bare bones as you go. I think a lot of people race these cars and they forget the extra weight they add when they race them. Russ from Swift Performance was over, and his car is also very light. Not as light as this, but quite light. But you forget things like fire extinguishers, all the safety things you've got to put in. You've got to keep your parcel shelf. You've got to separate your rear from your front. So you've got metal in the way to make sure that there's actually a dividing bit between the swirl pot that goes in the rear, for example, and the front of the car. So all these extra little bits that people put in, that's it. The key to my car has been buy the lightest parts possible, put as little back into the car as possible. Comfort is not a thing. Trust me, the drive to Portugal was not comfortable. But it's a track car, and that's what I wanted. Weight. The main reason was weight. I also wanted to see what the M54 could do. That was one of the things. The throttle bodies were a very, very late addition to the project. That was never the plan. Originally, it was just going to be take the M54 out, do all the work, put the M54 back in stock. And then a stupid conversation on a Saturday morning between Pete and myself and Nuno turned into me buying throttle bodies, throttle actuator, the adapter, and then the project took its shape. The throttle bodies are working with the OEM S54 actuator. Call it 3 parts, maybe 4 parts to the system. One is an adapter which you can buy off the internet, relatively easy. You can go on eBay and buy M54 to S54 throttle body adapter. You've also got the throttle bodies themselves, and you've got the throttle body actuator. I wanted to keep it as OEM as possible, so I've redone the loom. Contrary to most people's belief, obviously, the M54 throttle body has one plug, and it has, believe it or not, 2 TPS sensors. It's one plug, but there are 2 TPS sensors in that one plug. So although it doesn't look like it, there are still 2 throttle position sensors within the throttle body itself to work out where the throttle body is, just like an S54. Biggest difference is the S54 has one throttle position sensor on the actual throttle bodies themselves, and it has another throttle body position sensor in the actuator, and they work in reverse. So as the throttle opens, one loses voltage and one gains voltage. That's how they counteract, and that's how they know where the throttle is. It's actually relatively simple. When you look at both wiring diagrams, you realize that it's all there. They both have a signal wire, a ground wire, and a power wire. They're just separate. So you can link up the ground wires and the power wires together from the M54 wiring loom, and then you've just got 2 signal wires, which again is exactly the same as the M54, and then they work. The other thing to make work is the actuator. Now, this is the difficult part. This is the part I struggled with, and it took me a lot of weeks and a lot of banging my head and telling people, like, and to the point where I almost gave up, to the point where I know that it was doable with the OEM throttle body from the M54 because other people have done it that way, and they've cut the throttle body up and they've put rods and they've made it work. I didn't want to do that. Not to say there's anything wrong with that, but I wanted a more OEM look. I figured out that the reason that the S54 actuator didn't work to begin with is because an S54 checks if the throttle is stuck by opening the throttle and closing the throttle. So all it does is it actuates it open, actuates it close, jobs are good. An M54 almost has like a fail-safe mode. So the M54 throttle body is actually partially open when the car has no voltage, and it has springs going both ways. So when you turn the car on and the actuator tests, the first initial tests, if there is no actuator procedure set up, is it goes forwards a little bit, and then it actually travels backwards to 0, and then it settles up about 5%. That was the hard part. So once I'd worked that out, I then worked out that the reason I was getting the errors and the actuator wouldn't calibrate, or the S54 actuator wouldn't calibrate, was because it wasn't allowed to go backwards. It was smashing up against the throttle bodies, which were closed. So what I've done, and I don't think there's any photos or videos of this, or might have to take this one apart, is I've added some springs inside the actuator to mimic the M54 throttle body. The ECU detects about 5%, which I think is what it needs to do to detect that it's open, and my throttle bodies are partially open. This leads me into a different problem, which was the tuning, but we can get onto that. But that's been the magic to the system. It's been the wiring, which is relatively simple. I think most people anyone competent in wiring can look at the wiring diagrams and go, these 2 things work. It was the springs that made it work. The spring is the key to making the actuator work. If you've got the right, and again, I've made it work my way. I've got 2 springs in there, which works. I haven't actually got, I don't know the tensile strength for the springs. I've just made it work for me. I've made it work for my adapter. So I've 3D printed an adapter for the throttle body. I guess I skipped that part. That was one of the things that I'd done. So I measured it up and 3D printed an adapter, which in the end failed, but we had all the measurements in the end to make it work. But the adapter allowed me to mount the throttle actuator, which allowed me to then do the rest. But the real magic in this is the springs in the actuator. That's what allows you to use the OEM M54 ECU and still make everything work. The wiring could be made plug and play. I haven't at the moment because I've changed the connectors on my loom because I couldn't find the female correspondent connector to just plug into the OEM loom. I'm sure it exists. I didn't have the time to go looking for it. I just changed it. For me, it works. So potentially it's a plug and play, but not in the grand scheme of buy throttle bodies, buy this, buy that, make it fit and it will work. It'll never be like that. It will be, you could buy the parts, you could put the parts into the car, you'd still need to get your car tuned to make it plug and play. It's not a off-the-shelf kind of thing. Firstly, TRS's dyno is a bit of a heartbreaker. Okay, so I know most people will be like, oh, they make 231 stock, so on and so forth. There isn't many cars that make power or stock power on Peter's dyno. John's got a 330 himself. That made 213 horsepower on the dyno. You can adjust the factors if you want and make it make 230, but the reality is 213 horsepower. So my car made 225, realistically speaking, without much tuning. I know it spent time at the dyno, but most of that time was spent making the actuator work nice, making it idle nice for the trip, and basically removing fuel. Due to the fact that I've used the S54 injectors, the car was dumping fuel into the engine to the point where Peter took out, I think, about 25% overall. So you can imagine my car was overfueling by about 25% when I drove it originally, and I drove that not for very long, but I did drive it to TRS. Made it fairly safe. Could we have gone leaner? Yeah. Could he have messed with the ignition? Yep. Could he have messed with the Vanos? Yeah. Why didn't he? Because the trip was in one day. So quite frankly, he made it as safe as he could for the drive. Didn't want to play about with it too much. The idea was for me to go back and maybe have another go at it when we had a bit more time. And it's an old engine, 200,000 miles. And I mean, and in the end, it didn't survive, but that's that. You know, so it's an old engine. I don't know the history of it. I bought the car with 195,000. So I don't know if it's been looked at. I don't know if the head gasket's okay. You can throw it into any corner and it will just take the corner. We thought originally, because of how light it is, especially at the rear, that it was going to be really snappy. It was going to go snap on you if it lost traction at the rear. It's actually the complete opposite. And John and I drove it for a lot more than John, but John also had a chance to drive it. And it's really, really, really progressive. So you can feel the rear end go, you can counter, you can do a little bit of a slide, and you can carry on. It fills you with loads of confidence going around the corner, knowing that you're not carrying that much weight. You can brake so late. One of the biggest things, and having watched the track footage from Portimão and seen where the E92s were braking into certain corners compared to where I was braking into certain corners, and I know, again, there's going to be a bit of a speed difference, but I was braking so much later and still making the corner. That's one of the biggest differences is the braking. Again, I haven't got any brake cooling on my car. I don't think I need it. The car doesn't weigh anything. The discs are massive. It's probably over-braked, but I mean, the alignment was done so the car drove straight. No corner weighing, just the car drove straight. The suspension wasn't touched. It came out the box. Nuno took all the rebound off it. That's where it was left for the entire track day. I don't run a rear anti-roll bar on the rear. That's weight saving. I didn't want it to be too snappy. I think I could probably put it on. It still won't be too snappy, but again, that's one of the things. So if we dial in the suspension, which hasn't been touched at all, if we dial in maybe corner weigh it a little bit better and lift the car where it needs to be lifted and put it where it needs to be, and maybe give it a little bit more horsepower, I think it can play with most M3s on track without any problem. the real E46 LTW.